Not a movie review for you. This is the 1999 movie, The Cider House Rules, directed by Lasse Hallstrom, based on a novel by John Irving. Cinematographer was Oliver Stapleton. The cast: in the lead roles, Toby McGuire plays Homer Wells, Michael Caine is Dr. Wilbur Larch, Charlize Theron, in a very early role for her, plays Candy Kendall, and Paul Rudd plays her boyfriend Wally Worthington. Other members of the staff at the orphanage: Delroy Lindo plays Mr. Ross, Jane Alexander, Nurse Edna, and Kathy Baker as Nurse Angela. And I think that's probably about sufficient. Obviously quite a few children in here. Curly was played by Spencer Diamond, Muddy played by K. Todd Freeman, and Fuzzy was Eric Sutherland, and Peaches Heavy D, strange name. Awards: this movie was really well received by all three awards ceremonies. Firstly, the Academy Awards. Michael Caine won for Best Supporting Actor, and the Best Writing Screenplay was delivered to John Irving. Nominations for the Oscars also included Best Picture for Richard Gladstein, Best Director Lasse Hallstrom, Art Direction, Film Editing, and Musical Score. At the Globes, the nominations, two of them, for Best Screenplay for Irving and Supporting Actor for Michael Caine. And at the BAFTAs, one nomination for Michael Caine, also in Best Supporting Actor. So too, The Cider House Rules then. We arrive at the movie at the end of the 1920s. We're at an orphanage in Maine, in the United States, and we witness a young infant in the care of Dr. Larch, played by Michael Caine, and his staff. Some very good performances by Jane Alexander and Kathy Baker as two nurses in this orphanage, and we are told about the fact that this infant, called Homer Wells, was put up for adoption with two families, and they both returned the child, firstly because the child was too quiet, and then because the child was too noisy, was crying profusely. So the consequence of this is that Larch decides to not go for a third, and Wells becomes a member of the orphanage. We jump forward then to 1943, and the infant is now 18 years of age, a young man, and he has become almost a sort of son to the doctor, and is involved in all the procedures. Let's remind us, this particular place in Maine had been seen by many as the place that you go to for help and advice if you're a woman and you are pregnant and you are uncertain about whether you wish to keep the child. The orphanage, by its name of course, took on board young children and also carried out illegal abortions. The authorities turned a blind eye to this particular establishment, as it was sort of really not known by many, and certainly it was quite difficult to find out where exactly it was. So that's the backdrop to this movie, and we then witness the procedures taking place. Wells is acting as an assistant to Larch in the carrying out of these abortions, and what's striking is that in their quieter moments they seem to disagree profusely about the notion of taking a life versus the issue regarding the rights of the mother. Wells is very much into the religious feel, whereas Larch is much more pragmatic and considers the implications for a child brought into the world unloved. So this issue becomes a significant moral issue that is returned in the plot on more than one occasion. The movie laid out really in two specific parts. The first part is life at the orphanage, and the second part, which we will discuss later, is when Homer decides to leave the orphanage. So, having established this dilemma, this moral dilemma, we then sensitively get an insight into the sort of work that Larch, Wells and the nursing staff are involved in. We refer to giving a child a name and the significance of this, and also handling the fact that children who are up for adoption have already been rejected. Then of course there are sickly children to take care of, and also the fact that the environment has to be a priority to make it a happy environment for children to grow up in. And I love the fact that the movie focused on this, and we were created a picture of how loving this environment was, albeit there were shortfalls, naturally shortfalls, but the staff, in their efforts to make the children appear happy and content, even to the point of story reading being a task taken on board by the Dr. Larch or Homer at the end of the day. So it's really invites the viewer to feel good about this movie. We move on then to the arrival of a prospective adoptive couple, and we witness them going round the orphanage, viewing the children. Of course, they're all available. A brief sort of comments with the staff. It reminded me of how I went to the market here in Thailand and selected the puppy dog that I wanted, but the whole business was really quite invading, quite sinister, quite these vulnerable children, almost at a market, a free market, because there appeared to be no financial transaction taking place. And then finally the couple selected a young girl who is then prepared for her departure. Her small little case is put together, and then we witness her final moments at the orphanage as she walks to the car, and then the camera pans to all the youngsters with their noses squashed against the windows around the orphanage, and you can just get a sense of the pain and the emotional feeling running rife here. The children wishing and wondering why they weren't chosen, and it really does bring close to heart the whole notion of being an orphan and being brought up in one of these establishments. Not that I'm knocking the establishment, they do the best they can, and certainly this one was a good example, but it really was heart-wrenching to see these poor little faces as the car drove off. And then the staff, responding to this general feeling of unhappiness, put on a movie, a very early one. Of course, we're talking about 1940s, and they choose King Kong and there's this. We get a view of that awesome scene where the huge Kong shows some tenderness towards the woman as he holds her in the palm of his hand, and it all seemed to tie up very neatly with what had just happened at the orphanage, and how the staff were responding in small little ways to try and make these children feel less on their own. It was a tremendous, and what then follows is a fascinating Q&A between Dr. Larch and one of the young boys in his care, and he's asked by the boy about Larch's parents, and Larch responds by describing his father in not very flattering terms as a man who was full of cirrhosis and died an early death from alcoholism. And it's also seemed to sort of ring a number of bells that the children may well be better off here than with that type of parent. And I love that sort of style of approach to the script, where it provokes you into thinking clearly about the issues. And then Larch, he's not exactly 100% at ease with his own life. When he turns to his bed, he tends to anaesthetise himself with ether on a daily basis, which enables him to fantasize about sexual issues with women. Continuing the script, and this is not so much of a plot spoiler really. It's more about the impact really that it had on me. And I have seen this movie a couple of times before. A young girl's found near the orphanage. She's in a pretty bad way. It becomes clear that she has been trying to get to the orphanage, desperate to rid herself of the child inside her, had used some sort of device to try and kill the fetus, and as a result bleeding profusely, and the staff and Larch do an amazing job to save the child at the expense of the mother, who dies. And this again provokes another moral debate between Wells and Larch about the issue of abortions and the rights of the mother. These debates are all in good sort of spirit, but it does bring out the huge diversity in opinion over this really tricky social problem. Then we have the arrival of another couple, but this time they are in need of a procedure. Candy Kendall arrives. She's played by Charlize Theron. A very early role for Charlize, but she's tremendous in it. And she's with her boyfriend, Wally Worthington, played by Paul Rudd. He's an American serviceman. It's World War II, remember. And they have come to the orphanage because he's been on leave, and she is pregnant, and she doesn't want to keep the child, and he doesn't want to keep the child. And so they are asking if a procedure can happen, and this duly takes place, and it's a fairly routine matter. Charlize recovers relatively quickly, and then we approach the time where they're about to leave. Homer Wells goes about having chats with Wally, and it seems to have provoked in him the desire to get away from the orphanage, to explore life, to see life outside. his upbringing has been very, very controlled. He's very naive, and he wants to explore. And so what follows is he ends up joining them in their car, and off we go. The kids, of course, are deeply saddened by Homer's departure. He's become like a big brother to them. And anyway, we then move on to the second phase of the movie. So we move on then to the second part. Now we need to re-evaluate a little bit. Homer Wells, although being brought up in an orphanage, because of the atmosphere within that place, he is a well-balanced individual. He's morally sound. He is able to be sensitive, is able to care, and in many ways he hasn't got the baggage that many have when their childhood is littered with troubled events. So on that basis, when he arrives at the apple orchard where Candy's family are involved, he takes to it like a duck to water. He is very committed to work. He has a good work ethic. His fellow workers are all African Americans. They are sort of migrants who come up from the south to do this seasonal work. He relates very well to them. There isn't a hint of racism in him, so that's reciprocated. The African Americans warm to him, and overall he loves the experience. He learns quickly about the skills of apple picking, and he's also extremely enthusiastic when it comes to experiencing new things, and alongside that, of course, is his developing friendship with Candy. Wally has returned to active service in the war, and Candy and Homer develop their relationship, and it soon leads to affection, and we witness some quite amusing takes when Homer's clumsiness in showing his physical intimacy is brought to the fore, and the scene when they actually have intercourse is equally quite amusing, although Candy does her best to be a sensitive and caring teacher. Throughout this, Larch continues to keep in touch with Homer. He's got it into his head that he wants Homer to take over from him when he's too old and feeble and frail to continue the work, and he goes about creating false documentation such that when that happens, Homer will be able to take over without undue attention from the authorities. But Homer he's caught up in his new life, really, new experiences, and he experiences things like seeing a lobster for the first time, the seashore, he's never seen that before, going to a movie theatre, and it's all like a fairy tale to him. Alongside that is the encounter with the Rose family, the African American family. Mr. Rose is clearly in charge of the group of pickers, and his daughter is alongside him. But a major plot development takes place with regard to this association, and more of that in a second. It's also quite an irony that the title of the movie, The Cider House Rules, is actually a piece of written instructions that are pinned to the wall in the dormitory where all the pickers sleep. And the irony is that none of them can read. So when Homer arrives and he joins them, he's able to tell them exactly what's on the rules. And there's some rather amusing rules. You can't smoke, you can't sit on the roof. Anyway, I won't go through them all, but what's particularly poignant is that after he's finished, Mr. Rose makes a comment, and to the extent that those roles can't be for us, and it sort of hints at the notion of the concept of rules and laws, that they need to be made in a way that are followed by those that they are created for. And here clearly those rules that were pinned on that wall were for people who were able to read them. And as a result of this group of African Americans who have been brought up in a society that doesn't really care for them, isn't really willing to educate them, and then all of a sudden they get the benefits of not having to follow those rules, because a number of them actively smoke in the room. And this is also drawn out with regard to the comparison with the law with regard to abortion, and how the orphanage carries out their day-to-day tasks for the benefit of women who are regrettably pregnant and unable to look after their children. They're not following the rules either, and it suggests that this draconian religious law might well not really be of much use when large numbers of the population ignore it, and there's a lot to be said about that. Shortly after that, at the orphanage, a young boy, Fuzzy, who was a significant supporting role earlier on, who has asthma, passes away while the group are watching King Kong again. And Dr. Larch and the staff conveniently take him off and bury him in the school cemetery without them informing the rest of the children. And again, this is basically to protect them from that emotional pain, and it really does make one feel very warm towards this film. We then switch back to the orchard, and Rose, the daughter of Mr. Rose, is sick. She's pregnant, and Homer is the first to put two and two together, and of course he's got insight in this area, and he shares his fears with Candy, and they both try and counsel Rose with regard to the option of an abortion, but she's unwilling to leave the property and head for Maine. But when it becomes clear that the father of this child is in fact Rose's own father, the incestuous nature of this relationship provokes a response from Homer, who once again, he's free of all that baggage, all that sort of uncertainty, apprehension and perhaps fear about confronting Mr. Rose, and he comes right out with it and tells him what he knows, and Rose is confused, a mixture of hate and shame really, but he doesn't react in a typical scenario when you're boxed in and confronted with something that is clearly an illegal act, but also a shameful act. And this then leads to an agreement, passively as such, that Homer will carry out an abortion on Rose, and we witness that, and it's an emotionally charged situation, not from a aggressive point of view, from a from a tearful point of view. Mr. Rose insists that he wants to be present whilst the procedure takes place, but he can't handle it, and he has to rush out in the pouring rain because he's emotionally engulfed with the guilt. And it's an extremely powerful scene. Homer, of course, goes about his work very efficiently because he's been well taught. So incest is added to the list of social problems that materialise in this movie in America, in war-torn America, and I think this has got a great message about the image that we have of the land of the free, and yet what was taking place in America at that time, and to a lesser extent now, reflects on a society that really hasn't tackled these social problems, and this film certainly exposes them. But it's exposed in an impartial way. Hallstrom's direction doesn't judge, it just presents the facts. It allows you as the viewer to believe, to feel, to criticise as you wish, and that's, I find, a great message that this movie has. We then move on, and Wally returns as a victim of the war. His plane is shot down in Southeast Asia. He manages to get to Rangoon in what was then Burma, but unfortunately he catches encephalitis and he's returned home paralysed from the waist down, which again has quite an impact, particularly on Candy, who to an extent, although she has had a physical and affectionate relationship with Homer, still holds some warm feelings towards Wally, and that shatters her sort of view of potentially a life with children, etc. And it also has an impact on Homer, and it throws him really into a state of uncertainty. He relates this by saying that he needs to believe, he needs to be doing something, to be proactive, rather than doing nothing, which is how he's viewed his intervention here with regard to Rose and Mr. Rose, and also the doing the abortion has provoked these feelings again about him giving value after being somewhat self-indulgent whilst he's been at the orchard. And this is leads us to a further tragedy when Homer then finds Mr. Rose bleeding profusely from the private areas, and he is told in no uncertain terms by a Rose that he wants the authorities to believe that Mr. Rose has taken his own life. He's certainly bleeding to death, and there's little chance of survival, but he wants that. He doesn't want the police to open up an investigation, even though he acknowledges that he has been assaulted and attacked by his own daughter with a knife. We're not exactly sure the extent of the problem, but it could be castration, it could be removal of his penis, but the fact of the matter is that he then passes on, and Homer again passively has to react to another tragedy, and this again adds
more mileage to his belief that he needs to return to Maine. And this is what happens, particularly after he learns that Mr. Larch has passed following an overdose. The ether, I guess, has finally taken its toll, and so he leaves the orchard and heads back. The arrival at the orphanage is an awesome piece of direction. It's Halloween. All the children have made pumpkin faces as Homer arrives, and it's like the children view his arrival as sort of the return of a famous champion. He's bathed in friendship, in affection, and the staff welcome him, and of course he's there to continue the work of his perceived father, Dr. Larch, and he's now gathered a quantity of experiences, life experiences, tragedy, love, intimacy, and so he's now ready to continue the work in a better position than when he departed. It's a tremendous piece of work, this is, and although I enjoyed it the first time round, I didn't go into the details of it. The performances by Caine, who of course was nominated for a supporting actor nomination, and particularly Toby McGuire, who has come of age really in this 1999 movie. Wonderful. You must watch this movie. It is a tremendous piece of work.